Hi, listeners. Welcome to the Grief Out Loud podcast produced by the Dougie Center for Grieving Children. I'm Jana DeCristofaro and wanted to give you just a little heads up as you listen to this episode. You'll be hearing references to our old name, which was Dear Dougie. So just so you don't get too confused, you're listening to the right podcast, and we look forward to bringing you even more great content under the Grief Out Loud name. Thanks for joining us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Dear Dougie podcast, produced by the Dougie Center for Grieving Children in Portland, Oregon. I'm Jana DeCristofaro. After over 30 years of listening to the stories of grieving children, teens, and adults in our bereavement groups, we wanted to share what we've learned from them with the larger community. This podcast is a way to open up the often avoided conversation about grief. While grief is something we all experience during our lives, when we do have a loss, we often find ourselves confused and unsure about what to do, how to feel, or how to talk about it. So whether you're grieving a loss or wanting to support someone who is, we're here to talk about the questions that are important to you. Today's episode 19, I'm here with Tony Grace, our Chief Program Officer at the Dougie Center, and we're going to be talking about ways to support children and their families when someone in their life is dealing with an advanced serious illness. So welcome, Tony.
Thank you.
So glad to have you here. For those of you who are longtime listeners of our podcast, Tony was here for episode 8.
Yeah, way back in
the day. And in that episode, you talked a little bit about...
We did an overview of what families experience when they have a terminal illness or an advanced serious illness, and we kind of talked about the complexities of receiving such an illness and the impact that it has on a family. So we briefly went over some helpful tidbits of advice that parents and guardians and extended family members could do to support kids, but we really didn't have the time to go into depth over it. So that's what this is about.
Well, thanks for coming back to join us, and I'm really looking forward to, just having a conversation about what are some really specific ways that adults, maybe who are parents or caregivers of children, or, many times we talk with people who are family friends or other relatives who just want to know, how can I help this child or this teen?
Right.
So let's start with, I'm just curious, what's different? What do you find that is different in supporting kids when a death has occurred versus supporting kids when someone is dealing with an illness?
When a child has experienced a death of a family member, it's a final act. And so the relationship that they have with time is very different. When a child has a person who has an illness, time looks and feels very differently. And it's kind of like a race against the clock. They're always thinking about the timing of things, how much time that they have left, when is it actually going to happen. So there's a lot of fear and energy that gets put into just thinking about the nature of time. Whether it's a conscious or an unconscious decision, it doesn't really matter. There's just this focus of time. So there's also this feeling of rushness. I don't know of another term, or just expediency of everything.
An urgency around it.
Right, an urgency of just life in general versus after a death, that urgency isn't there. So much as there's usually a little bit more time and space in order to understand what you're feeling or how to express yourself.
It seems like when a death has occurred, there can be some urgency around when am I going to feel better, right?
Yes.
So that can come up for people, and then that's that sort of recognition over time, like, oh, this is a process, and I'm not going to instantly feel better one day. But it sounds like what you're saying is with these kids, it's this urgency of what's going to happen and how much time do I have.
Right. And when is it gonna happen when I'm in school? Is it gonna happen when I'm over at a friend's house? Is it gonna happen when I'm home? Like, how will I know? And when is it gonna happen? And in that case, most of us don't know exactly when it's gonna happen.
So what can that look like? Say, you've got a child who's maybe 4, or a child who's 12, or a teenager in high school. Do you have a sense of what that might look like for them and behaviors that
The
families
urgency?
might be seeing? Yeah.
Sure. It can look several ways. For teens, there's usually 2 opposite reactions that are both normal. One is like they just want to stay home the entire time. They don't feel safe in leaving the house, or they don't want to leave the person who's dying. The other reaction is they don't want to be at home at all.
They want to just be away at school with friends.
With friends, would rather live with somebody else entirely and not have to just be cognizant or present to everything that's going on. With younger children, it can look like a myriad of things. So one of them could be like, behavioral issues or reverting back to earlier behaviors. Like, so if they're 5, they may be wetting the bed or very clingy. It could also look like just wanting attention from the parent or the guardian who's well.
And I imagine that can look different. That sort of cry for attention might not be, hey, Mom, do you have a few moments to sit and read a story with me? It might come out in a more behavioral way.
Right, and it might come out at night, around bedtime routines. It might come out in the morning of refusing to get up. It might come out around like bath time, or even like when it's time to go and have dinner, refusing what's on the table, or requesting specific food. So it comes out in several ways.
So it sounds like with those kids, maybe there's a delaying of the actual activity to maybe extend the time that they get to spend with the adult.
Right.
Which is curious when we talked at the beginning about the urgency of time and how that can be sort of morphing in different ways for kids.
So if the primary caregiver for the person who is ill is also the primary caregiver for the child, there is this kind of tug of war between where am I going to invest my energy and my time, and for that caregiver, it really is a decision of what role are they going to fulfill. Are they going to be the caregiver for the person who's ill, or are they going to be the caregiver for the children and the teens who are present in the family? And
have you seen some or heard about some strategies from families from that primary caregiver of how they've managed that, or decisions that they've made?
Ooh, that's a really good question. It's going to be different for each family. One of the things that has helped is being in a support group with other caregivers who are dealing with that same struggle. Some of them have decided, like, okay, I'm going to give a set time for my children, so that each day, as part of our routine, they have an individual time with me.
An individual, like, separate time. It sounds like if there's multiple kids, having that unique time set out for Johnny and for Caitlin and for Jonah.
Right, and then finding someone else who can provide care for the person who's ill. Some of it is like just giving themselves permission to, like, I can't fulfill both roles at the same time, and our kids need us. Need me more than I can be with you, and asking for forgiveness from the person who's ill, and even if they can't provide it, being able to provide forgiveness for themselves because they can't be everything.
And I wonder too about just acknowledging that. I wonder if sometimes for some caregivers they're just tapped out for their energy, but really having someone say, wow, you're having to decide every day where to allocate your resources.
Every day.
Yes.
And sometimes multiple times a day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are some other just the basic needs that if you're a caregiver or you're a family friend, like, what are some of the things you want to be thinking about when a child has someone in their life with an advanced serious illness? I'm thinking even just talking to them about it. What are some tips or ideas for that?
Well, actually, so the first thing that came to my mind was usually friends and family members want to really help the family come around the family and, like, offer to do grocery shopping or mow their grass or, do some of the little things that they may not be able to get to do. One of the best advice I heard our families talk about was if you do offer to go grocery shopping, that you don't offer to pay for everything that they get, because then the family feels guilty because they don't want you buying toilet paper or some of their personal hygiene products. But if they paid you the money, and then you went out and just got it. It made them feel better. So just asking each family, like, what do you feel like you need in this moment? And being, throwing out ideas, but letting them choose and letting them also dictate how those get fulfilled. As far as conversations go, just being able and willing to say, how can I support you? Or like saying, hey, I see that you look a little tired and exhausted. Or, I noticed that, your interactions with your children are pretty heated. Would you be okay if I gave you some time away just for yourself? Or can I take the kids out? And agreeing upon, like, maybe we'll go to the park or go to, watch a movie and just talking about different things that they can do outside of the home. So
having someone who's just paying attention, noticing, and
right.
kind of, I would imagine it would take some courage and fortitude to say to a close friend, like, it looks like maybe you could use some help.
Right.
Here's what I'm thinking I could do. What would be most helpful for you? And I think
right.
it seems like that could be kind of scary the first time you do it.
Yes, but not giving advice. So a lot of...
not like, you really need to take a bubble bath. You look real tired.
Right. Or, well, this is how you need to handle your children, or how you should raise them. So that is not the time or the place to offer free advice.
Parenting advice.
Right. Because, this family is experiencing something that they've never experienced before. So they're bound to make mistakes, and that's okay. And they're going to find their way through it. And you don't want to be a roadblock to them finding the rhythm and the right way through it for this family. So
that's really some support for the caregiver.
The caregiver.
And then say you are a parent or a caregiver and you're trying to figure out, how am I going to talk to my child about the illness that their brother or their
right.
sister or their parent or their caregiver has? What are some things that we want to make sure we have in mind when we're talking to kids about the diagnosis, the treatment, all the changes
Sure.
that are happening?
There's usually a lot of fear that we have as adults talking with kids about illnesses and death and dying and grief. And so just being able to check in with ourselves first, and understanding, okay, what am I feeling? Am I being anxious? Am I trying to protect them and not share information? Or am I sharing too much information?
Or am I protecting myself? Because it's really hard to say these words to my child and I'm not sure how to
Right.
respond to their emotions.
And a lot of times we'll say, we'll just wait for the right time, and typically there is no right time. The right time is the time that we create. So a right time would be providing enough space and time for children to ask questions, being able to understand exactly what it is that I'm going to share with each of family member. So if you have a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, they're going to understand this illness very differently. So the best frame of reference would be to speak in a language that the 4-year-old can understand first. And then...
What might that sound like? What's an example of how you might explain to a 4-year-old that, mommy has leukemia?
Sure. So, it would be basically, mommy has an illness. It's called leukemia. What this illness does specifically is there's these little cells that live inside your body, and usually those cells are really helpful and help somebody to survive, but sometimes they get a little haywired, and or they go bad and they start growing, and they grow and grow and grow, and they take over all the good cells.
They're not working the way they're supposed to be working.
Right. And that eventually will mean that mommy will die, and this is what death looks like. So mommy will stop breathing, she'll stop talking, she'll stop feeling. And so, that might be the very first time a child experiences a death. So, understanding the permanence of death will happen over time. it won't happen in that conversation per
As
se.
it does for adults too, right? We cognitively understand that death is a permanent thing, but even as adults, we still get to that place of, is this real? Did this actually happen? I keep
Right.
thinking I'm going to see them when I come home. And so
Right.
I know for me, when I'm talking with younger kids, it's helpful to recognize that even though cognitively they may be in a different place than I am, I can still relate to
Right.
the questions and the fears and the concerns they have because they're similar to mine, but it can just be more prominent for younger kids.
Right. And then, being able just to share that with a 4-year-old, with the 8 and 12-year-old who are present, and then I would take the 8 and the 12-year-old aside and have a separate conversation with them, allow them to ask more questions if they're interested, but also to keep an open invitation for all 3 kids, if that's your family, to say at any point if you have questions, feel free to ask. I may not have the answers, but we can certainly find or seek out people who may have those answers. So.
Or maybe let's make a list so that when we go to the doctor, we can make sure the doctor can answer your questions too. Because I could imagine so often there's a long list of questions that the adults, the person who has the illness and the adult who's in the caregiving role might have, but it could be, I imagine, really helpful for if the kids come with them to the appointment to say, let's ask the doctor your questions too, and have more of a direct communication. That way kids feel like their questions matter and they're really important.
Right. And, then there's this question of timing. Like, when do you share it? So do you share it early in the illness? Do you share it, late in the illness? And that's going to be dependent on each family member as well. I think for most of us, the earlier, the better. That way that they have time to prepare and to create memories and to talk and to discuss it with the person who is sick.
Because I imagine there's some families maybe who say, we're not going to tell the kids until we start to see some symptoms,
Right.
because, she's not acting any different, she doesn't look any different, nothing's really visible.
Right.
But I would imagine for kids, if by the time the person starts to have symptoms, maybe things move a lot quicker, and then kids didn't have time. And I just know for me, being in the bereavement groups where there's already been a death, there's a lot of kids who are like, I wish they had told me sooner,
Right.
because I would have made some different choices. Maybe I would have decided not to play baseball that season so I could spend more time with my dad, but I didn't know.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So just being able to connect with each family member at the very beginning of the conversation and just kind of share, here's what's going to happen in the next year or 2 years, or
To the best of our knowledge.
to the best
As
of
far
our
as we
knowledge.
know,
This
'cause
is
it
what
could
the
change.
doctors are saying. Can really change the entire experience. So this event is going to change your family forever. And we have the choice of the story that we're going to create around it. So we can do and put in our best effort to create a good story. And a good story is one that your family is going to have to define. But I would say it's basically where information is being shared, and there's this level of connection with each person within the family, and where each person feels like they can trust the other family members, where there isn't this sense of betrayal because information was being kept or secrets were being kept. So being able to share all of that in a language that children understand.
Have you come across any stories of ways that kids have been invited into participating in the caregiving process in a way that felt good for the kids?
Yeah, so being able to care for the person who is ill can be a huge empowerment for each child. So it could be as simple as just making sure that the person has water or flowers in the room, or making artwork for the person. So whether they're at home or in the hospital, having those things in the room that the person is in can be a constant reminder that this child is in that person's life and is caring for them in a way that they can. Sometimes it's, massaging their feet, or
Rubbing lotion on dry skin, or
sitting
bringing the
down
special water
and reading a
glass.
book, or just, writing down memories, something like that.
And
Yeah.
I imagine similar to as we talk with kids who have had a death, that letting kids make the choice about what's important to them. Because as a well-meaning adult, we might think, here's something you can do.
Right.
The child's like, I don't want to do that.
Right.
I want to do this. And so
Right.
asking kids, what would you like to do? Recognizing that they may not be able to do what they would like to do, but maybe you can compromise and make that a process where kids are active participants in deciding.
Right, and we can also give them a menu of here's a whole list of things that we can do to tell mommy or to show mommy that we're caring for her, or to demonstrate to dad that like we love him. And yeah.
So I know we're getting close on time.
Yeah.
It goes by so fast.
It does.
And for listeners out there, we'll have a list in our show notes of all these great suggestions that Tony had, so that you don't have to be scribbling furiously out there trying to remember everything he said. So we'll have our show notes with suggestions. And Tony, I'm wondering, just for the last little bit, is there any kind of legacy activity that you've heard about? And so when I say that, I'm thinking of ways that the person who is dying can create memories or a legacy for the kids that they're leaving behind. Is there anything you've heard of that's really stood out?
Yeah, there also is a caveat. So one of the things, a lot of times the person who is ill will wait before they do any of these legacy things, because they want to focus all of their energy into getting better, or that they're denying that there's this possibility that they could be dying, and so they don't want to do this, because if they do any legacy thing like writing down their life stories or creating videos, that would mean giving up. So for those families who have that, there's usually a lot of guilt and frustration when a family member who is the one who's dying has waited, and maybe has waited too long to do it. And so there's this absence of what could have been. With that said, if it's early in the diagnosis and the person is still cognizant and has all of their faculties with them, there's plenty of things that they can do in order to leave their legacy. So I've heard of parents writing letters to each one of their children around significant events. So maybe when the child's going to turn 16, or on their 21st birthday, or when they go off to college, or when they get married, or having their first kid. So just writing down like tidbits of wisdom of, sharing their own story of when they turn 16, or here's what I wish I knew. I've also seen videos of parents who've left videos for their kids around specific events like that as well. Sometimes it's creating a memory box together of things that were significant, so that the child can access that memory box 10, 15, 20 years from now.
And that can be an interactive process
And
that
that can
the
be an
person
interactive,
does with the
right.
child.
Right, so creating things together. So it could be photographs together, it could be creating objects, it could be taking things that were significant in that child's life and in your life as a parent or a guardian.
And I imagine that as somebody who's trying to impart wisdom to children, if I'm dying and I want to make sure my kids know everything I need them to know, that could feel like a lot of pressure, to be wise and sage in that way. And I know from listening to kids after someone has died that they value anything, like any random memory or just a story that the person says. And so I imagine kind of taking down that pressure of this having to be
Right.
the last things that I share with you. And as we were talking earlier about ways that kids can help in the caregiving process, I wonder about, a 4 or a 5-year-old being equipped with just an iPhone camera and going in and videotaping a conversation that he has with daddy. And he gets to be the interviewer, or
Right.
some way to make that legacy creation an interactive process.
And one of the other things that extended family members and friends can do is write down stories that they have of the person who is ill, and then collecting all of those stories and putting them in like a book, so that a child can go back and read those when they're older and be like, oh man, I didn't know that my dad
Right.
was such an adventurer, or was so funny, like with all of his buddies, or like
Yeah,
that.
my dad was always so serious as a dad, but what? He went on a Harley Davidson ride when he was 18? I had no idea. So
Yeah, or that, mom was a softball player or something like that, and and she went on some tournament, and like some things that the kid will never know unless somebody else tells them that story. So being able to have a collection collection of stories is really invaluable.
Right. So if you're a listener out there and you're friends with a family who is experiencing an illness and you're wondering what you can do, that's something you can start with, just jotting down memories that you have and saving them to give to the kids. And I know one of the things I try really hard in my life when I do that for other people is to ask them if they want to see them and say, I have them and I can send them to you, but I want you to know what's in there so that people don't just open up. I've heard of families who they open up an envelope and all these stories come pouring out and they were not prepared. They weren't ready to look at it then. So if you're out there and you're doing that, put a little note on there. Say it contains memories of.
Open when you're ready.
Yeah, open
or
when
something
you're ready.
yeah. And you'll know the time.
So, Tony, thank you so much. I know the time has flown by.
Wow, it
so
really
I
has.
imagine you'll be back again for part 2 of this. So, listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll have show notes up for you. Again, this is episode 19. So you can find us on our website, www.dougie.org, and you can also look us up in iTunes, which if you do that, please feel free to give us a rating or write us a review. That'll help other people find us. If you want to learn more about the Dougie Center, you can check us out on Facebook. We're also on Twitter. And we'd love to be talking about the things that mean the most to you in this podcast. So if you have ideas for episodes or if you have questions you'd like us to dive into at some point, send us an email at help@dougie.org and just put podcast somewhere in the subject line so we can be sure to find you. So thanks again for listening and join us again for our next episode of the Dear Dougie podcast. Thanks so much, Tony.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.